Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. Now, folks, we had a 5-minute late start tonight. Apologies for that. We had some technological difficulties, as they say, owing to the computer lead coming flying out the back of the computer, which didn't help when we moved it. And so that took us back for 5 minutes, but we're here and we're back in the ring, folks. Sorry for that slightly late start. Let's say hello straight away to Debbie, who was first in tonight. Good evening, Debbie. Glad you're in the house, as is TC. And Paul says he's looking forward to AFFG's election commentary while avoiding listening to whatever nonsense the PM is spouting in his TV interview tonight. Well, we've got a lot of comment and we're interested in what your comments are as well about the election and who you think is going to come out smelling of roses as a consequence. So please do send in your comments. And hello also to Derek. And fellow unionists, he said, we had a great day last Saturday. Loads of the public coming to our stall. We've got some photographs of that, which we're going to show you in a few minutes as well. And thanks to Derek and the rest of the team who were there. It was one of the best events, best street stalls that we've had in Glasgow for a long time. Really went well. Oksana, hi to you and hi to that Preston journalist. Anyone voting reform? Well, there will be quite a few people voting reform. Are you a candidate by any means? Are you at liberty to tell us that Preston journalist? If you are, we'd be very interested to know if you are standing for them at all. You might not be, of course. But if you are, please tell us. In fact, if there's anybody standing for any political parties that's in the house tonight, please do make yourself known and we'll give you and your party a shout out. Derek is also on TikTok. We're also on TikTok. Yes, we're on TikTok and we've got some viewers on there already. So please, on TikTok, send in your comments. Tell us what you're thinking about the state of British politics. Good evening to D-Tube. Good evening to Melissa and to Alan and to Stuart from the lovely city of Elgin. Hello to Violet. Good evening to you. And Alan says, well done with the successful stall. Now, what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to look at the progress of reform and we're going to ask if they are really going to cook the Tories goose. We're also going to touch on the Workers' Party, the George Galloway Party. Are they going to take votes from Labour? Very possibly so. There's George Galloway is going to be appealing, well, across the board, of course, and he appeals to very many people, but he especially seems to appeal to the Muslim population of certain of the northern cities. And if they go with him, then they're not going to be voting for Keir Starmer, and that's going to cut into Starmer's vote as well. Anybody got any figures on how many candidates the Workers' Party are standing in throughout the United Kingdom? That would be interesting to know. I know that they're standing in quite a few Scottish seats as well. And Reform is standing in every single Scottish seat, which is really quite something. That's 57 seats here in Scotland, and Reform has got a candidate in every one. Now, I will point out that some of those candidates are actually England-based. So we're presuming that many of those English-based candidates will be paper candidates only. But, you know, that's being a paper candidate is a long-established trait in British politics. In fact, the Tory party famously used to do quite a bit of that as well, putting in candidates. This was in the past, perhaps, but not so much now. But they used to do that. In fact, Lord Rees-Mogg, was a candidate for a Scottish constituency. I think his first ever constituency, they put him in a Scottish constituency, and he actually went up and he worked that constituency. That was a while ago now, though. That was probably back in the 80s. That Preston journalist, that's interesting news. He says Workers' Party have 194 candidates. That's out of 362 candidates on the mainland, not including the 18 additional which are in Northern Ireland. So 194 out of 632. That's a fair showing. That's about a third, almost a third, which is very good. TC says he was watching David Clues interviewing Ben Aston of Reform UK last night. What a sensible young man, standing in Bournemouth West. He talked a lot of sense. Good. Okay, Derek, can you confirm that we are broadcasting on YouTube now? I believe that we are. Ansel Man says it was good that an independent was second to Galloway when Galloway stood in Rochdale a few months ago. We'd need more such independent candidates. Gets us away from the sameness of the failed big parties. Daniel Thomas says Nigel Farage must build bridges with Tommy Robinson. Well, we'd see. It's an interesting point, actually, because what's going to happen to an extent is if Reform do well, then there will be pressure upon them. There will be a tension within Reform. There will be the tension that they want to go along with the system. And that means accepting all the shilaboughs of the current orthodoxy that you must never question on all sorts of historical matters, political matters, matters relating to British heritage and immigration matters and things like that. There'll be a tendency to take the easy path and not pick fights with the media and the powers that be. And there will also be the tension which takes them over to the edge, as it were, to pushing the envelope, to rowing the boat out a little further, to shifting, as they call it, the Overton window, to bring in other topics. So it will be interesting to see how Reform deal with that moving forward. At present, what they have done is they are very keen to be in the good books of the mainstream media, which sets the bounds of acceptable political debate on all matters. They've wanted to keep within that, and that's quite understandable. It's politics after all, and you need to be able to sometimes go along to get along. However, if you are genuinely wanting to make change, then you do have to confront and challenge and not back down on certain matters in order to be able to shift the political debate in a direction which will enable you to talk about the things that you need to do. And that's called creating a counter-revolutionary consciousness. And to what extent will Reform and the leaders of Reform be able to create a counter-revolutionary consciousness, breaking away from the consciousness of the current system that maintains the current system? That will be the question. Let me maybe give you a for instance to try to elaborate upon what I'm saying. You know, the small boat situation. the current consensus that you have to go along with says these are all persecuted people, they're all vulnerable people, they all deserve our protection. The counter-revolutionary consciousness says no, they're not vulnerable and they're not threatened, and in fact they're more likely, some of them, to threaten us, and so they need to go back. That's the counter-revolutionary consciousness, and that does require, if you're going to be in public, that does require a certain set of cajoleons to be able to articulate that. And I do think that people like Farage are certainly able to and do articulate that well, and that mentality can only grow stronger under a counter-revolutionary consciousness. However, if you just go along with like The Guardian and to an extent all the other papers, then you're not going to be able to create the words, you're not going to be able to say the words that are necessary in order to do what has to be done, because without words, as we always say, there can be no action. So here's hoping that that will build and Reform will be able to develop their attitudes on these sorts of things. Because I do believe as well that the younger cohort, people under 30 years old, are really thinking along completely different lines from like the older people, the Richard Ticeys and those sorts of people, and people my age and older. The younger population are looking around and they're saying, I'm never going to get a chance of a house. Why am I last on the council house lists? How am I ever going to get a council house if there's literally 1.2 million people coming into the country every year? Let's forget about even getting a job to earn enough to buy a house. And so the younger generation are realising that they've been kind of screwed over by the present system. And so they're looking for people who have got an alternative way of looking at things. And that's where groups like A Force for Good and the other people that we associate with and so on, that's where we come in and we can articulate a different way of looking at things. And that certainly begins with stopping all immigration, basically shutting it down completely. We don't need it. We don't need it for the GDP. We don't want it at all, and it has to stop. And then it has to be reversed. So it's not about how many people can we lower it by, it's like how many people can we actually convince to leave. That's really what the real debate is about. And you can convince people to leave perfectly reasonably and perfectly democratically, and indeed give people financial incentives to do so as well. Because what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Standing on the street and getting mowed down every day by the Deliveroo army? And it's people are saying that. It's like they don't want to get into town anymore because it's dangerous walking on the pavements. And it is. It is very dangerous walking on the pavements in some of these big towns and cities now. Absolutely appalling. Anyway, times they are a-changing, as somebody once sang. And this is going to be an election that's going to change things. How's it going to change things? Well, we have a first past the post system, and there is a chance that the Reform UK party and the other smaller parties as well, let's not forget them. There's lots of good smaller parties out there. There's the Freedom Alliance that's going to be standing. We're going to be interviewing the Freedom Alliance leader next week. There's David Curtin's Heritage Party. They're standing 60 or 70 candidates, including at least one in Scotland. There is other parties, such as, of course, the Scottish Family Party, and we'll be interviewing one of them as well prior to the election. And that's a great party here in Scotland as well. So there's lots of other smaller parties. So when you on July the 5th, when we add together all the votes for Reform and all the votes for the smaller parties, it's going to be millions of people, millions and millions of people. And Nigel Farage might be the only outlier who's even elected. because that's the way the first past the post system works. But so long as there's millions and millions of votes for the other parties that are not Tory, Labour, Lib Dem, SNP, or the Green sellouts, as long as there's millions of votes for those other parties, then Keir Starmer cannot come in and say that Britain has somehow rejected the politics of the far right, because that's going to be his line. It's going to be that the Tories got decimated because the people are no longer right wing. Okay, that Britain suddenly moved all the way to the left. Well, of course, that's just a complete load of nonsense. And it will be shown to be nonsense if there's millions and millions and millions of votes for the other parties. So that's one of the big things about voting for these other parties, is that you can show Keir Starmer that he's wrong when he says that Britain has rejected the politics of Brexit, that Britain has rejected the politics of immigration control, that Britain has rejected the politics of net zero. We'll say no, it hasn't. It's literally voted in its millions for immigration control, for energy independence, for oil and gas, and for national sovereignty outside of the corporate state known as the European Union. So exciting times that we are living in. And in our way, in the way that we've seen it, the Conservatives and Labour have offered really nothing yet that would inspire us at all. Labour are going to fill in apparently 1 million potholes. Somebody brought that one to my attention. 1 million, they counted them. Apparently there's 1 million. Although this person said there's 1 million in her district alone. However, Labour are going to fill in 1 million of them. That might be enough for some people to be convinced to ruin the country otherwise. Yeah, they'll fill in the potholes. But they'll also, everything else, they'll ruin. So you'll have pristine streets running through a dystopian wasteland. Ansel Mann says, some are calling for July the 4th to be Independence Day, as in independent man or woman. Let's have a refreshing change from the big parties. So Ansel Mann is probably going to be voting for somebody on their ballot paper that says independent, meaning not affiliated with any particular political party. And that's often a good move as well, provided you know who the person is and what it is in fact the person believes. That Preston journalist says, I am considering voting reform, was asked to be a candidate but didn't have the time this election. That's understandable. You're a very busy content creator, and very possibly your work for the nation will be just as well served, if not better served, as the patriotic content creator that you are, sir. Fantastic. Daniel says he's watching on YouTube. Folks, if you are watching on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up. And if you're watching on X, formerly known as Twitter, please give us a like, please give us a repost. And if you're watching on Facebook, please give us a thumbs up and a share, because that's the way that we get this message out. And please do comment in the comment threads on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube as well, because all of that helps the algorithm and helps the system to know that we're broadcasting and brings us to the attention of more people. Filling the potholes indeed. Andrew Bridgen is standing as an independent. He was a Tory, but he spoke so much sense that the Conservative Party were unable to handle the volume of common sense that was coming out of his mouth. And so they did what these major parties usually do when somebody is speaking too much sense, and that is they disown them and claim that the person is not representing their values. So I do hope that Andrew Bridgen gets in, because he is a genuine British patriot. And what constituency is he standing in, Violet? Can you remind us of that, please? Paul sends in a very interesting thought. Question. He says, would like your views on this. Vote Unionist in Northern Ireland. Absolutely. Vote Unionist in Northern Ireland. Reform in England and Wales, and Labour in Scotland to stop the SNP. Well, I agree that we should vote Unionist in Northern Ireland. I'm very sympathetic to reform. As far as voting Labour in Scotland to stop the SNP, that would be known as tactical voting. There's, I'm not quite sure exactly how many seats Labour think they can take off the SNP. The Tories think they can take about 6 from the SNP. Whether you want to vote tactically, really, that's up to an individual. I personally will not. My personal view, and I'm only speaking personally, not corporately, but my personal view is to vote for what you believe in. And tactical voting is for the birds, because you'd always be tactically voting. If Britain still exists in 5 years' time, and if there is another general election in 5 years' time, are we going to be tactically voting again? So, you know, tactical voting isn't really just a one-off. It's basically a way of approaching all elections. I prefer voting for the people and or parties that you believe in. That's my own personal view. And if you don't have a party to vote for, if you don't have a person to vote for, then you can maybe think about voting tactically or not. That would be my view. But I couldn't, in all good conscience, tell people to vote for any of these major parties. I mean, look what has happened to this country in the last 14 years under the Conservatives. And I don't want to upset any Tories watching, but, you know, the Tories claim they're for freedom, but they locked the country down for 2 years and have sent all these millions of immigrants into the country, 1.2 million long-term immigrants in 2023. That's unacceptable. You can't be voting for them. As for Labour, well, they're going to do the same thing. They haven't said that they're going to cut immigration to zero. And as for the Lib Dems, the leadership of the Lib Dems. I'm always talking here about the leadership of these parties. I'm not talking about necessarily their individual supporters, but the leadership of the Lib Dems are traitors. And I can give you a for instance. Yesterday or 2 days ago, the Lib Dems released their manifesto. There's a picture here of Ed Davey that will just stick up. The article appeared in the Daily Telegraph, and it said that the Lib Dems intend to, there it is, Lib Dems pledge to give foreigners right to vote. Manifesto pledge from Sir Ed Davey's party. Okay. So, what's that about? Well, at the moment, the only people who can vote in British general elections are British citizens. And, for historical reasons which we'll get into, citizens of the Irish Republic and citizens, wait for this, of any British Commonwealth country, if they are legally resident here. And there's 56 other Commonwealth countries apart from the UK, including India. Okay, I'll get into that in a minute. But first, let's look at Ed Davey's idea. Now, what Ed Davey wants to do is give the vote to everybody who simply legally resident in the United Kingdom. And if any Lib Dems get elected to the British Parliament, that's what they will advocate. And if Labour also come up with this crazy notion, and we've spoken about this before, a couple of programmes ago we spoke about this, or was it last week we spoke about this? If Labour come up with this idea, Lib Dems will support them in it, as will the SNP. And so that's going to give the vote to several million new people. I think that the article said it was 4 million European Union citizens, and I don't know if it mentioned how many others, but it could be hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Let me just see. The Labour Party giving. Under the plans, the electorate would expand to include almost 4 million EU nationals, while almost 2 million people with pre-settled status would be granted the vote in future. So that's 6 million people. Adding another 6 million to the franchise, literally overnight, for the next election. You cannot, in all good conscience, ever consider voting for a party that would do that. And people say, well, what's so special then about citizenship? Well, if you become a British citizen, you have to commit. You have to commit to the nation. You have to give away your old citizenship from whatever country. You have to be here at least 5 years, and you have to see a long-term future for yourself in the nation. And so it involves commitment to the country going forward. That's really the thing about it. And if it's to mean anything, then there has to be special privileges attached to that, one of which should be voting for the government. But if you're just going to give the voting right to anybody who's simply squatting here for a few months before they go to another country to squat in, then you are basically destroying the idea of British citizenship. You're saying it means nothing. That's what they're doing. And then they'll come up with the stupid things like, well, if they're paying the taxes, they should be represented. No. If you're working here and paying taxes, that's your choice. If you're not represented, too bad. If you want to be represented, then go back to wherever it was that you came from, or go to another country where you can work and make money. But just because you're working and making money here and paying taxes doesn't mean you get representation. The two things don't follow. So if you're going to kick up a fuss that you're working and you're paying taxes but you don't have representation, sorry mate, the door's that way. Okay, the door's that way. We're not putting up with that whinge at all. And this is the sort of thing when I say counter-revolutionary consciousness, okay? We cannot be going along with the Ed Davies of this world. We have to be able to say, you're talking rubbish, and worse than talking rubbish, but you're actually undermining the basis of this nation, and therefore you have to go. Concentrate on playing on the swings or whatever it is you're trying to do for clicks on social media these days, Ed Davey. Concentrate on that. Falling down a water chute or something like that. That's about the level that we expect from you. Don't try to get involved in constitutional politics. Certainly nowhere near the levers of power. And that goes for all the Lib Dem leadership. So, people will say, well, what about dual citizens then? Well, I'm not a fan of dual citizenship, as you no doubt can imagine. I think that if you're a dual citizen, I think you can become a dual citizen, but it means that you don't get to vote. Okay? So dual citizens should not be allowed to vote. Because you have to commit to the UK. And if you're still hankering after the old land or some other country, then fine, but you don't get to vote. You don't get to vote in this country. That should really be a new law. Okay, dual citizens don't get to vote. That's one I'm going to start pushing, actually. So it wouldn't stop the idea of dual citizenship, because there is one or two, well, I can only ever think of one advantage from our perspective of dual citizenship, is in that it makes it easier to deport the person, because they've got a citizenship that they can go and live in another country. So it's a lot easier to deport people with dual citizenship. That's about the only argument that I can see for dual citizenship. But you can still have it, but you just shouldn't be entitled to vote, okay? And you know, our country, Britain, has never properly looked at those sorts of things. Our ruling class is based in Whitehall. They, until quite recently, they were all of a sort, and they didn't really put much effort or thought into anything that they were doing. And how on earth we even managed to get to like 2024, I have no idea, really. Because I'll give you an example of how they've put no thought into things as well. I mentioned earlier about Commonwealth citizens getting the vote. Right, that law, it's not even a law, it's just become a convention. And it dates, would you believe it, to over 100 years ago. In 1914, there was a law. And the law said something to the effect that everyone in the British Empire, there was still a British Empire before we absolutely destroyed it ourselves through 2 world wars, but in 1914 they said that everybody who was in the British Empire was a British subject of the king, which in fact they were, because the king was the head of the British Empire. And everybody in India and Canada and New Zealand and Australia and all these African countries and so on, they were all, technically they were subjects of the king. And so they were allowed in law to consider themselves a British subject. Now, that's different from a British citizen. A subject and a citizen are different legal concepts. We still have the concept of British subjects today. It's a form of British nationality, and it applies to a small number of groups. But these days we talk about British citizens, and these are people who have to go through the citizenship process. Anyway, back to 1914, everybody virtually in the world is now a British subject. And through time, and I haven't been able to discover exactly how, but there was another law passed in 1918. In fact, we'll bring up a picture of this and I'll just read what it says here. Why can the Commonwealth vote? Here it is. This is from a government publication published in January this year. And it says here in the centre, the British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act 1914 put into general statutory form that any person born within His Majesty's dominions and shall be deemed to be natural born British subjects. It meant that citizens of the British Empire who were resident in the UK fulfilled the requirements of the Representation of the People Act 1918, which would follow 4 years later, and could register to vote. Now, I'm not sure what happened or why these British subjects became recognised as able to vote. And maybe I need to look at the 1918 Act a little harder. But I couldn't find anything in it when I looked this afternoon. But certainly it dates from 1914, British subjects. Okay, so we have the First World War, we have the Second World War, we have the 50s and 60s, and all these countries left the British Empire. But they stayed with us as the British Commonwealth. But what it meant was that most of these countries became republics. Okay, they cast off the British monarchy. And so they were no longer British subjects. India, for example. The people in India today are no longer British subjects. So why are they still considered able to vote when they happen simply to be resident in this country for a few months? Makes no sense. And again, there's no reciprocity here. I cannot go to India and vote. Voting in India is strictly for Indian citizens, citizens in law. So why are these I don't know the numbers, but they're going to be large numbers of people able to vote? This is just because the British establishment hasn't bothered to look at this and re-examine it for well over 100 years. Now, in this that I just put up here, in 1982, the Home Affairs Select Committee reviewed the voting rights of Commonwealth and Irish citizens as part of an investigation into the Representation of the People's Act. It recommended no change, and it goes on to say, though the historical background is different, the evidence put forward on behalf of Commonwealth and Irish citizens has many common elements. Both groups are arguing for the maintenance of their existing civic rights. No kidding, no kidding. Of course they're going to argue for that, rather than seeking new ones, and both feel threatened by the expression of opinions in certain quarters that these rights should be diminished or removed. In neither case did such a proposal find a voice in evidence to ourselves, and it would seem therefore that there is no widespread public demand for the removal of the voting rights of either Commonwealth or Irish citizens. In neither case did such a proposal find a voice in evidence to ourselves. Well, I can assure you, lords and ladies, in 1982, and I remember 1982, virtually nobody in the United Kingdom would even be aware that such a debate was going on in your lordship's house, and even if they were aware, how on earth would they contact you, and how on earth would they make their point known? So, in other words, that's just an excuse. Even to this day, most people don't know who's got the right to vote and who doesn't. And the right to vote is the most important civic right in our society. You know, I was brought up in the 1970s. I remember asking the old people, the older people, like, what makes us different from like Russia, and why is there this Berlin Wall? And they'd go, well, here in the United Kingdom we're a democracy, and in Russia it's a dictatorship. And so ever since then I was like, right, democracy must be a really good thing. That's I must look into that. And it was kind of ridiculous, really, because the democracy in 1974 was a choice between Harold Wilson and Edward Heath. And that was like meant to be this amazing thing that we had fought for. However, as I've grown older, I have really come to admire and like the democratic system, but at the same time realizing that it only works when certain things are in place. It only works when it's a simple manner of voting, such as ballot paper. It only works if you can trust the counting mechanism. And it also really only works if you are prepared to agree that the people who've outvoted you have sufficient in common with you that you'll go along with their point of view for 5 years. And so it really only works well in what might be called homogenous societies. And I'm not talking necessarily about ethnically homogenous, although sometimes that can be an issue. I'm talking about at least being culturally and socially homogenous, having the same values, ideally the same religious view of life, and a commonality. And it still works to an extent in the United Kingdom, and touch wood, we do still have a good way of voting by going to the ballot box. However, that's been heavily compromised by the postal ballot. And one of the things that I wrote about, I'm doing a 10-article series on basic principles of patriotic sovereignty. And the very first one is make sure of the integrity of the vote. Make sure that the vote is honest in the first place, because everything derives from that within a democracy. Everything derives from having faith that the vote is honest, that the voting system has integrity. If the voting system doesn't have integrity, if things are happening to it that call into question its honesty, then society itself will start to crumble. So the vote is so important. One of the reasons why we want to ban postal voting, except for those who are physically disabled or out of town. So that's so valuable. How did I get onto that? Yeah, so the Commonwealth citizens voting, again, that needs to be looked at, and it really needs to be stopped. And what I would suggest, and I'm being a generous man here, okay, I understand that Commonwealth citizens vote derives from their previous situation as a British subject back in 1914. Okay, so let's hold to that, and let's continue to give the vote to those citizens of the Crown Commonwealth. Now, the Crown Commonwealth are 14 countries of those 56 who still have the king as head of state. So, okay, they can have the vote because they are still intimately connected with the British political system. And those 14 countries would be Antigua and Barbuda, Australia, the Bahamas, Belize, Canada, Grenada, Jamaica, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu. Okay, those 14 countries can still have the vote in the United Kingdom, but the other 44, sorry, and that includes India, you're not getting the vote anymore. You're not getting the vote. In fact, all of this was prompted by this graphic which we saw last week. Which international students can vote in the 2024 UK general election? And there are all the Commonwealth countries that can vote if you happen to be here for a few months on a work permit or whatever, and you're intending on heading back the day after the election, you can still vote. Had to look up Kingdom of Eswatini. Apparently that's the new name for Swaziland. Other people that can vote are, of course, people in the Crown dependencies, which are Guernsey, Isle of Man, and Jersey. And the British Overseas Territories down there at the bottom. And that's these are the countries that Britain still governs. So it makes sense to allow them to vote if they also happen to be in the country, because they, after all, are very much British subjects of the King. So that's, and I'm not so sure about the Hong Kong thing. I don't know if they should be given the right to vote, really. I mean, there's kind of infinity immigration from Hong Kong and China, really, at the end of the day. However, that's the situation. So our policy would be, Commonwealth citizens, sorry, you don't get the vote unless you're a member of the Crown Commonwealth country, which will be 14 of those countries. Anyway, tell that to Ed Davies, see what he thinks about it. Maybe him and Keir Starmer could sit around a table and go, this Alistair McConnachie chap from A Force for Good has got it all figured out. He's got it all figured out. All we need to do is get him in, get him to write up the law, which will take me about half an hour, and let's pass it, emergency legislation, and get it through by August of this year. Yeah, that's what we need. That's what we need. But seriously, we see our role as coming up with these ideas that other people who are better placed than we can take it forward. Folks, let's have some comments. Derek says he got his general election form today. And like last year in England, you will have to provide ID at the voting stations. So remember to take along your photographic ID. Ansel Mann says Scottish Family Party is Conservative and would presumably be a good ally for Conservative Unionists. Laird Kilbarchan says Starmer won't care about what the figures say, they'll act like Khan in London. Ansel Mann got a few comments. Diet says the important thing is to vote for principles. But there's the dilemma of whether to cast a tactical vote to keep out the worst. Yeah, well, that's the dilemma, isn't it? Cornfrog says he's not interested in potholes when the country is being ripped apart. I get it. I get it. Derek says time for a complete change. He's voting reform. Alistair says, what platform would you prefer us to watch AFFG on to give the best results for exposure? Thank you for asking. The answer to that is YouTube. The answer to that is YouTube. That gives potentially the best exposure in the long run. So TC, you're watching on YouTube. We also get like 0.00001 pence for every view on YouTube as well. So monetarily, it can help us. Something that I wanted to mention, and we've come up with this today, right? We come up with a lot of stuff that you don't hear until you hear it here first. And that is, this election coming up on the 4th of July is the 75th British general election since the Union of Parliaments in 1707. In 1707, the Scottish and English parliaments were forged together to make the British Parliament, and then in 1708 there was the first ever British general election for a small number of, obviously, very wealthy landholding men. And then their idea developed in time to the point where we are today. There were 17 such elections prior to the union with Ireland in 1801, and there has been 57 since then, giving 74 to date, which means that this coming up will be a significant moment. A significant moment. It will be the 75th British general election ever held. And you know, British people, we don't tend to think in those terms. We at A Force for Good are all about numbers, obviously, but the Americans do. Like, they'll go, oh, Donald Trump's the 45th president, or Joe Biden is like 46th. And I was thinking about that today, and I thought, well, how many even general elections have we had? So I did a bit of research on Wikipedia and added the numbers together, and I'm like, holy moly, it's the 75th coming up. That must mean something. That must mean something. Tell the world. Tell the world. So you'll be hearing that now. You know, you'll be hearing these people talking about it. I bet you on election night as well. David Attenborough, whatever. Who is it that does the election night? It's not David Attenborough, that's the animal bloke. The other guy. Tonight, the 75th British general election. Will it be the last? Daniel says Starmer has openly admitted that he's in cahoots with Davos and the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum. All a Labour vote is for more power to be given to these unelected companies and for us to be enslaved. Oksana, straight to the point. Ed Davey is terrible. Hope he doesn't get in. Thing is, if he doesn't get in, it'll be replaced by some other tacky twerp. And he'll be forgotten about. I mean, who remembers Humza Yousaf? Remember him? Like, literally forgotten about after 48 hours. Yesterday's man. That's what happens when you're a politician. Catherine says, take your pen to vote, no pencils. I always take a pen, absolutely. The votes get counted at the poll at the count, as it's called, and these counts are staffed by people from the council who do the counting, and each candidate gets to take up to 10 counting agents along with them. And the job of a counting agent is very important, and your job is to check that the piles, you're not allowed to touch the votes, but you can watch them being counted, and what you want to do as a counting agent is to make sure that the votes get put in the right piles. So X for Independent Green Voice gets put in the Independent Green Voice pile, X for Freedom Alliance gets put in the Freedom Alliance pile, X for Reform gets put in the Reform pile, and then also that these piles don't get put on top of each other by mistake. I've seen that happen and called it out. And sometimes it can just, and almost always it's just an unhonest mistake. But you do have the power as a counting agent to say, hey, could you just check that? That didn't look right. Oh, sorry, my mistake. Yeah, no problem. You've got that authority as a counting agent. So that's quite a good thing as well. Dimbleby, that's the man's name. Is he still around? I won't read that one out. Good. Jack Cox says that he's loving the show. Thank you, Jack. He says to subscribe to Mayor Tussie. Derek says, great show from the team. Thank you, sir. Some comments on TikTok. Somebody thinks society can function without government. That's the sort of comments you get on TikTok. I'm afraid it wouldn't, because who's going to pick up the bins? Okay, presumably you use bins. Unless you're actually prepared to take them to a dump yourself, then you're only going to just end up living in a giant dustbin. So government is essential for us all. That's why it's so important to be involved in it, if only once every 5 years. Never knew Alvin Stardust was a raving unionist. Well, my cuckoo, this one is. Walter thinks none of the parties care for the people of Scotland. Well, I think that some of them do, but you do have to. I think everybody who goes into politics does go into it with a good heart, albeit many of them a confused brain. But I think that there is an inherent goodness in what many of them are trying to do, especially the fringe parties, so-called, when the candidate really is in it because he or she believes in it and often knows that the reward may not be forthcoming. So if you do have a smaller party candidate, do lend that person your vote, because you know they do care. Some people talking about UKIP. Never heard of them for a while these days. I think they've got one candidate standing in Scotland. If there's any UKIP people watching, please tell me. I know they've got one in, I'm not going to say, it's Motherwell. British Unionist Party also has a candidate in Motherwell. So that's an unnecessary split of the vote, unfortunately, but these things happen. So I'm trying to find some comments here on TikTok that develop a point. I'm afraid quite a few don't, but always happy to see the Scottish nationalists coming in and attempting to make a point. Good. Okay, folks, it's the top of the hour. Well, we're going to run for another 2 or 3 minutes because we were late, weren't we? We were 5 minutes late, so we've got a few minutes just to go. And Englishman Dan says, when I was a kid, I remember my dad mentioning that candidates had to make an effort to look more patriotic than each other if they were to have a shot at winning the election. Well, Labour are certainly trying to do the patriotic thing. I saw one of their Rachel somebody, don't know her name, she's standing there, she's like on the front bench. Yesterday she's making a press statement and she's got 2 Union Jacks on either side of her, 2 of them, not even 1, 2. I was like, oh well, at least I like to see that. But will they do anything? As Englishman Dan's dad said. Englishman Dan's dad's dog's dead was the latest I heard. Yes, okay. Well, folks, so much to talk about, but that's the hour up. Please do, if you can, check out our shop, where we have the latest issue of our magazine, which is issue 10, Indy Myths Busted, volume 2 of Busting Indy Myths. Please do, if you can, get our book, which is over there, so I'm going to have to walk round. One Big Country, a big book for the Union, volume 1. All you need to do is go on to amazon.co.uk and search for One Big Country. This tells you basically what we all believe in. And it's volume 1. Volume 2 will be out at the end of the year. It's part of a projected 5-volume series. So we're really knocking it out the park. We're putting the streets on lockdown as far as intelligent unionist commentary committed to print is concerned. And who could forget the classic A Wee Book for the Union? And do you know what I've entirely forgotten about? It's our crowdfunder. I knew there was something I had to talk about. We're starting a crowdfunder today. In fact, it's already up. It's been up for half an hour, and it's at crowdfunder.co.uk/union 2024. Oh, no, it's not. Don't tell me. Let me see. Yes. We've got £10 already. And it's at crowdfunder.co.uk/P/union 2024. There we go. I think one may have to insert a thing in there. Let me see. if that is going to work. Yeah, should work. That address should work. And we are trying to raise £1,707. And if that figure is familiar to you, 1707, it is of course 1707, which was the first ever British Parliament. And so we came up with that figure in order to remember the 75th British parliamentary election, which will be coming up on the 4th of July. So we thought 1707 was a good figure to go for, and goodness me, we certainly do need it, and especially to prepare for what might happen after the election. We want to be in a position where we can respond to whatever we need to respond to, because obviously it's difficult to tell what the situation is going to be, but there may be matters that we need an immediate response to, whether in print or whether with outreach or whether with video or whether with demonstration. And so we need to have a backup policy in place. And so that's why we need to just be making sure that the bank account is looking healthy enough. And as you can see, we're running this very professional operation on clearly very, very small amounts of money. So anything that you folks can do to contribute to that 1707 goal over the next 28 days, please do check it out. And there's lots of rewards available as well, including this wee book, which comes with basically every reward, and this book as well. So folks, check out the crowdfunder. There we go. Screenshot. Now, on that happy note, Paul says, we'll get some more for friends. Excellent. And hit the like button to help the channel. Good. Folks, it just remains for me to tell you that we'll be back next week. We've got a special guest who's the leader of the Freedom Alliance, Dr. Alan McManus, who spoke at our Free Speech Rules rally back on the 20th of April when we took on the then First Minister, Humza Yousaf, and told him what we thought of his anti-free speech laws. He'll be with us next week talking about his party, who's standing at least one candidate here in Scotland as well. And then we'll have guests from other parties in the remaining 2 weeks before the general election. So it just remains for me to say thank you for watching. God bless the United Kingdom, and God save the King. See you next time.